They never saw it coming. The moment my brother's attorney walked into that conference room, adjusted his tie, and said, "Good afternoon, Dr. Chen," I watched 20 years of my brother's certainty collapse in a single breath. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. I was 22 years old, standing in the driveway of the home I grew up in, holding a cardboard box with everything I owned. It was February, the kind of cold that bites through your coat and settles in your chest. My brother Marcus stood in the doorway, arms crossed, not saying a word. He didn't need to. He had already said everything through the attorney's letter he'd placed on the kitchen table 3 days before. My father had died 6 weeks earlier, and Marcus, 11 years older than me, and the executor of a will I had never been allowed to see, had decided that I would receive nothing. Not the house. Not the savings. Not the medical practice my father had built over 30 years. The letter said I had abandoned the family's interests by choosing to pursue my own education instead of staying to help manage my father's clinic during his illness. It said I had been a source of conflict and instability. It said, in clean legal language, that my father had amended his will in the final months of his life. I didn't believe it, but I was 22. I had no money for an attorney, and Marcus had 3 of them. So I picked up my box. And I left. What Marcus never understood, what he never bothered to learn about me, was that leaving didn't mean giving up. It meant I was done fighting on his terms. My father was a quiet man who loved medicine, the way some people love God completely, without reservation. He came to this country from Taiwan with $40 and an acceptance letter to a state university. He worked nights cleaning hospital floors while studying during the day. By the time I was born, he had built a small but respected internal medicine practice in our town in central Ohio. He had 2 children. Marcus, from his first marriage, and me, from his second, after my mother came into his life and then left it again when I was 4. Marcus was always his father's son, in the way that made other people nod approvingly. He was tall, confident, already in business school when I was still in middle school. He knew how to shake hands and look people in the eye. He knew how to be the version of a son that neighbors talked about at block parties. I was the quiet one, the one always in the corner with a book, the one who asked my father too many questions about the patients he saw, who followed him around the clinic on weekends like a shadow, who decided at 13 that I would become a doctor not because he wanted me to, but because I genuinely could not imagine doing anything else. My father never pushed me, but he saw me. I know he did, because sometimes he would come into my room after a long day and just sit at the edge of my desk and say, "How's your studying going?" Not to check, just to be near it. Near me. When he got sick, really sick, the kind of sick that changes the geometry of a household, I was finishing my junior year of undergrad 3 hours away. I drove home every weekend. I sat with him through the bad nights. I learned his medication schedule better than the home nurse they'd hired. Marcus called twice a month from Chicago, where he had moved for a job, and he sent money, which everyone agreed was helpful. What Marcus also did, in those final months, was come home more frequently than usual. He had conversations with my father behind closed doors. He brought an attorney to the house once, on a Tuesday, when I happened to be back at school. My aunt, my father's younger sister, a woman named Grace, who had always been kind to me, mentioned it offhandedly one Sunday, not realizing what she was telling me. I didn't know what it meant then. I found out 6 weeks after my father passed. The amended will left the practice, the house, and the majority of his estate to Marcus, citing my absence during a critical period of family need. A small account enough to feel like an insult was designated for me. I contested it. I found a legal aid attorney who took my case on a limited basis. We filed the paperwork. Marcus responded with a team of 3 lawyers, a stack of documents, and a letter suggesting that if I pursued the matter, he would countersue for the wages he had allegedly covered during my father's care. I was 22. I had $43 in my checking account. I had a cardboard box in the trunk of a 2003 Honda Civic. I dropped the case, but I kept every document, every letter, every medical record I had from those final months. I kept them in a manila envelope in the bottom of whatever bag I was living out of, and I moved them with me through 4 apartments and 2 states over the next decade. What I did next, I did quietly and without telling anyone. I finished my undergraduate degree. I worked 2 jobs, hospital billing during the day, a dinner shift at a family restaurant 3 nights a week. I applied to medical school. I got rejected the first year. I applied again. I got in. Medical school is its own kind of war. You learn to survive on 4 hours of sleep and the stubborn belief that the information you're forcing into your brain at 2 a.m. will one day matter. I was older than most of my classmates. I had a hollowness in me from the years before that I didn't talk about, but that I used it like fuel. Every time I wanted to quit, I thought about standing in that driveway in February. I thought about the look on Marcus's face. Not angry. Just done with me, already past me. I did my residency in internal medicine, my father's specialty. Not as tribute, exactly. More like continuation. Like picking up a sentence someone else had started. There was a man during my residency, a supervising physician named Dr. Harold Watkins, who was 64 years old and had the kind of steadiness that made anxious residents breathe slower just by walking into a room. He reminded me of my father in the way he listened fully, without already composing his response. He became my mentor. When I told him about my father's practice, about what had happened, he didn't offer sympathy. He said, "Then you know exactly why the work matters." I held on to that. I also, during those years, fell in love. His name was Daniel. He was a public health researcher, thoughtful and funny, the kind of person who brought coffee to a conversation he knew would be difficult. We dated through the end of my residency. He asked me to marry him on a Tuesday evening in our apartment kitchen. No ring yet. Just him looking at me over a bowl of pasta, saying, "I'd really like to spend my life with you." We got married the following spring. Small ceremony. Dr. Watkins gave a toast. My Aunt Grace cried. We had a daughter, Maya, 2 years later. She had my father's eyes, that particular stillness in them, like she was taking in more than she was letting on. I did not invite Marcus to the wedding. I did not send him a birth announcement. As far as I was concerned, he was someone I had once known. I completed a fellowship in geriatric medicine. I joined a practice. I was made a partner. 4 years ago, the Ohio State Medical Board appointed me to their physician review committee. 3 years ago, the hospital system I worked with asked me to serve as the medical director for their regional network, a role that put me in formal oversight of physician conduct, licensing compliance, and clinical standards across 11 facilities. I did not think about Marcus much. I had a life, a good one, the kind my father would have recognized. And then, 14 months ago, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, with an Ohio area code. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of reviewing a staffing report. I picked up. Claire. The voice was older than I remembered. Slower. "It's Marcus." I sat very still. "I need to talk to you," he said. "It's about Dad's practice." What Marcus explained, over the course of a 20-minute phone call I mostly listened to in silence, was this. He had kept my father's clinic running for several years after the inheritance, mostly as an investment property, leasing it to a rotating series of physicians. It had become profitable. He had then partnered with a private equity group to expand into a small network of 3 clinics. That network had grown, and then a series of decisions, bad hires, billing irregularities he claimed not to have known about, a malpractice settlement had brought the whole structure under regulatory scrutiny. The Ohio Medical Board was investigating, and somehow, through the expansion, through the paperwork, through the licensing trail that followed my father's original practice tax ID number, my name had been pulled into the documentation. Marcus needed me to sign an affidavit clarifying my historical non-involvement so that his attorneys could use it to establish a clean break in the ownership record. He needed it within 30 days. "It would really help me out," he said. "It's just paperwork, Claire. You weren't involved." "This just confirms that." I asked him one question. "Did you send me a copy of everything the board has requested?" He said he would have his attorney follow up. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called my own attorney. What she found, over the following 3 weeks, was layered and intricate and, in places, breathtaking in its carelessness. The billing irregularities Marcus had described as someone else's problem were, in fact, documented across 4 years of records. 2 of the physicians who had leased the original clinic space had filed formal complaints not with the state board, but internally, through the practice management company. Marcus controlled complaints that had been quietly closed without resolution. One of those physicians had since relocated to another state, the other had retired. The malpractice settlement involved a patient who had been seen at one of the satellite clinics. The supervising physician's credentials, it turned out, had not been properly verified through the credentialing process required by the medical board, and the credentialing process, the oversight of that process, fell under the jurisdiction of the regional committee I chaired. Marcus had filed a civil complaint against me 6 days earlier, naming me as a responsible party in the credentialing failure, on the basis that my historical connection to the originating practice made me a relevant administrative overseer. His attorneys, apparently, had not done a complete check of my current title. My attorney called Marcus's lead attorney the following morning to arrange a meeting. She told him simply that her client would not be signing anything and would be responding formally to the civil complaint. She mentioned, in passing, my current title. There was a pause on the line. "I'm sorry," the attorney said. "Can you repeat that?" She did. Another pause. "I'll need to speak with my client," he said. The formal meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at my attorney's office downtown. I arrived early. I wore the same coat I had worn the day I stood in that driveway 20 years before I still owned it. I don't entirely know why, and I sat at the conference table with my hands folded and my notes in front of me. Marcus arrived with 2 attorneys. He looked older. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He didn't look at me directly when he walked in. His lead attorney came in last. He was carrying a leather folder and reading something on his phone. He looked up. He saw me. He stopped walking for just a moment, barely perceptible. But there and then he set his folder down, straightened, and said, "Good afternoon, Dr. Chen. I apologize for the confusion in our earlier correspondence." Marcus turned to look at him. Then he turned to look at me. "I don't understand," he said. "Not to me. To his attorney." "What is she?" "Your sister," the attorney said carefully, "currently serves as medical director for the regional network, which means she sits on the credentialing oversight committee that my client's complaint references." He paused. "She is, in effect, the person your complaint is addressed to." The room was very quiet. I had prepared a response. I had organized the documentation. I had been ready for this moment in a functional, professional sense for 3 weeks. But sitting there, watching Marcus's face move through confusion and then recognition and then something older and harder to name, I realized that I had been preparing for this moment for much longer than 3 weeks. My attorney walked Marcus's team through the documentation. The credentialing failure, it became clear, was not a failure of oversight on my committee's part. Our protocols were current and fully documented. The gap existed in the practice management layer that Marcus's company controlled. His complaint, as filed, named the wrong party and relied on a misunderstanding of the administrative structure. It would not survive a formal response. His attorneys knew it within the first 30 minutes. I could see it in the way they stopped taking notes. By the end of the meeting, the civil complaint had been withdrawn. Marcus sat through most of it without speaking. When his attorneys were gathering their papers to leave, he stayed in his chair. His attorneys stepped out to make calls. My attorney stepped out to give us space. I didn't ask her to. She just understood. Marcus and I were alone in the conference room for the first time in 20 years. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He said, "I didn't know you were." "I know," I said. "Dad would have." He stopped. "I waited. I made decisions back then that I told myself were practical," he said. "I told myself you were young, you'd be fine, you didn't need it the way." He stopped again. "I don't know if I believed that. I think I just wanted to." I had imagined this conversation many times. In some versions I was cold. In some I was eloquent. In some I simply walked out. I had never imagined that when it actually happened, I would mostly feel tired. Not in a defeated way. In the way you feel tired after you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time and you finally set it down. "What do you want from me, Marcus?" I asked. Not unkindly. He didn't have an answer. I hadn't expected one. I told him that I had no interest in pursuing anything further through the legal process. The complaint was withdrawn. The board's investigation into his clinic network was a separate matter, handled by people who had nothing to do with me. That was his to navigate. I told him that I kept a copy of every document from 20 years ago, not because I had been waiting to use them, but because I had needed, for my own sake, to hold on to proof that the story I remembered was real. I told him that our father had been a good doctor and a decent man, and that he deserved to have his practice remembered well, and that whatever Marcus had done or not done in those final months, I had made peace with the fact that I would never fully know. I picked up my notes. I stood. I put on that old coat. Maya has his eyes, I said. If you ever want to meet her someday, you can call me. I didn't wait for him to respond. I drove to the cemetery on my way home. I don't go often. I'm not someone who needs a physical place to remember people I carry with me. But that evening felt like it required something. I stood at my father's grave for a while. The sun was going down. It was cold in the way. February in Ohio is always cold. And I stood there and I thought about a man who cleaned hospital floors at night to pay for books he read in the morning, who built something from nothing, who sat at the edge of my desk after long days just to be near my studying. I thought about how he would feel, knowing where I was, knowing what I'd done with the years since that driveway. I think he would have nodded in that quiet way of his. I think he would have said, "How's your work going?" And I would have told him honestly, for the first time in a long time, without the weight of what I was carrying, "It's going well, Dad. It's going really well." I got back in my car. Daniel had texted to say Maya had asked 3 times when I was coming home. I wrote back that I was on my way. The road was dark and the heater was running, and I drove the 20 minutes home thinking about almost nothing at all. Which is, I have learned, one of the finest feelings in the world.